Well, now we're back in 2022, and I have another bit of introduction to add before we launch into all the music. Back in 2003, when I made these, I would often suggest to the students, if they enjoyed a particular excerpt that I had supplied, that they could go out and hear the entire work by buying a CD. Well, these days, CDs are pretty much defunct. It's hard to even find a CD player. So, if you wished to hear an entire work, there's an even better way. And you probably know what I'm speaking of. You can click onto YouTube, click in the title of the work, and there are three ways you can actually listen to that work in its entirety. First, you might just be listening to the music with only one or two photos up. It might be a photo of the CD cover from which it was extracted to put up on YouTube. It might be a picture of the person performing it, or it might be a picture of the composer, something like that. A second way is that occasionally you will find the score of the music along with the sound. And that way, as you're listening, you can actually follow the score. That's very interesting. Forces you to really focus. A third way, and perhaps the best way, is that very often you can actually find a live performance. So you're not only hearing the music, but you're watching the performers perform it. If it's an orchestra, you might see the flutist when she has a soloist, certainly see the conductor conducting, or the cello section when they have something important. That's a really, really good way of doing it. In any case, my advice to go purchase a CD won't make any sense to you, but I certainly do recommend that since all I'm giving you are excerpts, that you may wish to get acquainted with the entire work. I hope you will.
So let's begin with looking at symphonic music, and Bach is our first. Well, now, what is symphonic music? It's music written for just orchestra, without special soloists or vocalists or anything like that. If you go to the Colorado Symphony, you'll hear orchestra music. Now, Bach wrote actually very little just for pure orchestra. He often was accompanying choirs or singers, and we'll hear that when we get to vocal music. But just pure orchestra music, there really just are only about 10 pieces. 6 of them are called Brandenburg concertos, and it sounds like they're concertos, but they're really orchestra pieces. It's not quite the same as concertos that we think of today. There are 6 of these, and I think the most colorful one may be number 2. I'd like you to hear excerpts from all 3 movements. You can hear that different instruments get to be soloists momentarily. And the trumpet is featured very prominently. And now a selection from the slow movement. There are 3 movements: fast, slow, fast. And now the last movement. That was Brandenburg Concerto number 2, and now I said there were 10 pieces that I know of from Bach's orchestral output. The other 4 are called suites, and Bach, as you know, wrote a lot of suites for solo keyboard, but these are for orchestra. Very interesting, and I'd like to hear, my favorite of these 4 is number 3. Let's hear a little bit of orchestral suite number, and there are 5 movements. Suites are multi-movement works, of course, just like, well, we'll see when we get to some of the later works in this genre. All these things are multi-movement works, but suites tend to have a lot of movements, 5 or 6 or even 7. That will not be the case with symphonies and concertos. All right, we're going to hear a little bit of each of the movements. It begins with an overture. Now, the second movement of this suite is entitled Air, and it is undoubtedly the most famous piece of orchestral music that Bach ever wrote. You've probably heard this. It's sometimes called the Air on the G string. It's an absolutely gorgeous melody. Well, maybe you could tell that piece had repeats in it. It was, as you may know, in suites we get a lot of binary forms, and binary form means repeats. Two parts, each part repeated, and I tried to leave out those repeats. Now, the next three movements will just only sample a bit. This third movement is called a gavotte. Here it is. That's the end of the first half. Repeat. Second half. And so forth. We'll have to go on now to the next movement, which is a bourrée. First half, repeat. Very short. Second half. And again, we'll have to go on. The next movement is a gigue, the last movement. So we'll just hear that much. Well, now, in any survey of symphonic music, what you're going to encounter mostly are symphonies. Now, what is a symphony? Well, now this I have to talk a little bit, sorry. A symphony is just like a sonata. I think I've explained this to many of you. It's just like a sonata, except it's written for orchestra. It's a multi-movement work, with each of those movements using the special structures, musical forms that were, some of them, invented in the classical period. The one in particular that's used so much is what we call sonata form, and I won't go into that here. Another one that's used very often is rondo, and I won't go into that. But many of the movements, individual movements of these multi-movement works, whether they're symphonies or sonatas or concertos or string quartet, are written in sonata form or rondo. Occasionally you find a set of theme and variations, and even one of the forms that's used sometimes is from the old Baroque suite, the minuet. Sometimes you find that embedded in one of these multi-movement classical works. Now, the classical period, think of that as beginning around after Bach died, 1750, let's say. Three main composers there are going to be Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. Now, Haydn was born in 1732, so you can see, and we're going to start with him. He's the first of those great ones of the classical period, and you can see that he would have begun writing his many works. He was totally prolific around late 1750s into the 1760s, and then 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, and then he kind of retired the last 10 years of his life. He didn't die until 1809. Mozart, meanwhile, had come along, done his thing, and died around 1790. Mozart was doing his great writing, overlapping with Haydn in the 1770s and 1780s. Immediately after Mozart died, Beethoven got going in the 1790s, and then for another 25 years or so into the 1800s. And so that kind of gives you an overview of when they were operating. Now, all of these composers were writing instrumental music primarily. The classical time frame, this period from 1750 to 1825 or so, was a more secular time in music. The Baroque period was actually, there was a lot of sacred music written. In fact, you probably don't realize it, but half of Bach's output is religious music. Well, only a very small fraction of the classical music that we have is religious. It's mostly instrumental. They loved writing these multi-movement works, and symphonies were one of their favorite things. Haydn wrote, well, if I ask you to guess, you'd probably never even come close. He wrote 104 symphonies. Now, each one of those works is anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes long. That's an enormous amount of music to have to write all those parts for all those different players in an orchestra. Good grief. Mozart wrote 41 symphonies. Beethoven only wrote 9, but they're larger. Well, we'll get to those. Let's begin by sampling a Haydn symphony. Most symphonies have 4 movements each, not just 3. 3 is standard for sonatas. 4 is the standard thing for symphonies. So we're going to just hear just the exposition of one of the first movements. This is number 101. It has a subtitle. Some of Haydn's symphonies have subtitles. This one is subtitled The Clock, because one of the movements sounds a little bit like a ticking clock. It has a slow introduction to the first movement. We won't hear that. We'll just jump right to the main theme of the first movement and hear the exposition only. Well, now you've heard the exposition only of one movement of one of the 104 symphonies of Haydn. But I hope that intrigued you a little bit, and you can look into that. You could spend a lifetime getting acquainted with Haydn symphonies. Haydn is actually referred to as the father of the symphony because he wrote so many, and many of them are quite good.